On this week's 51%, we speak with UNC professor and author Sonya Ramsey about her new biography celebrating the life and accomplishments of educational activist Bertha Maxwell-Roddey, reflecting on the impact of educators and the power of Black leadership.
Her authenticity helped to propel people to want to join her cause. She was able to see leadership abilities in people and not judge them by how old they were or who they were.
It's all coming up on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jessie King. It's back to school season across the U.S. Whether you're moving into your college dorm or buying new school supplies, we're quickly getting back into the swing of things. For teachers, it's been a rough couple of years. In addition to the continued threat of school shootings and the roller coaster set off by the coronavirus pandemic, classrooms have become a front line in the country's ongoing culture war, with parents and lawmakers increasingly debating what should or shouldn't be taught, or said, or displayed in the classroom. As our guest today will tell us, that last bit is not necessarily new, as our schools and teachers have always played a key role in social change. Dr. Sonya Ramsey is the director of the Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and the author of the new biography Bertha Maxwell-Roddey, a modern-day race woman and the power of Black leadership. Born in 1930, Bertha Maxwell-Roddey's story is a prime example of the impact educators have on their local communities. Her list of accomplishments is about a mile long, and teachers will immediately recognize how much her teaching career extended beyond the chalkboard. But as Ramsey writes, it also provides an important insight into the work that went into desegregating America's schools, as Maxwell-Roddey and her peers turned the sentiments and legal victories of the civil rights movement into tangible accomplishments felt by students of all ages for decades to come. In 1968, Maxwell-Roddey became what Ramsey calls a desegregation trailblazer by serving as one of the first Black women principals of a predominantly white school in Charlotte. She went on to develop the Africana Studies Department at UNC, co-founded what is now the Harvey B. Gantt Center for African American Art and Culture, and created the National Council for Black Studies, helping to formalize the field of African American studies and expand programs in schools and colleges across the country. At every step of the way, Ramsey stresses the service leadership exhibited by Maxwell-Roddey. With an innate ability to connect with others and bring people in, Maxwell-Roddey shines a light on the power of Black leadership and the effectiveness of everyday, boots-on-the-ground activism. We bring you now that full conversation with biographer Sonya Ramsey.
I had the opportunity to do this oral history project sponsored by the Ford Foundation and Duke University, where we went around the South interviewing people who experienced segregation. And our first focus was North Carolina. And we did, the interviews were suggested to us, but I just happened to, by happenstance, to interview teachers. And I found that they had a story to tell as they went through the process of teaching during segregation and then going through desegregation and after. And I thought that no one's really telling that story or not telling it to the extent I wanted to tell it. So that became my research focus over time. And so I began, my first book was on teachers in Nashville. And then this book, I moved to Charlotte and I just happened to sit in a meeting, kind of a lecture named after this woman, Bertha Maxwell-Roddey. And her name sounded very familiar, very, very familiar. You ever had that when you remember a name and you just can't remember where to place it? And when she came into the room, the sorors or members of Delta Sigma Theta sorority stood up. And I am a member, but I was not active in the sorority. I hadn't paid my dues. And I said, oh my goodness, she's the president. She was the president of the organization. Oh my goodness. And I realized she had done so many things here at UNC Charlotte. She started the Africana Studies program. And I was really turning my focus, research focus, to looking at what happened after desegregation was really put into place. How did they make it work? Who were the key players in facilitating the process? And I realized she was a central person in Charlotte to do so. And I said, the eureka moment, my light bulb, my next book project. So that's how I became interested in Dr. Roddey. And the more, it's been a long process. She's a force in nature. I found out that she helped co-found the Harvey B. Gantt Center here, our African American Cultural Center that is a regional art center. She helped found the National Council for Black Studies. So many key aspects of institution building. And so that's why I thought she was my research focus. And it's definitely been an interesting journey. I'm learning about her and doing research. Yes.
So where did Bertha Maxwell-Roddey get her start? She became one of the first principals of a predominantly white elementary school in Charlotte, but how early was that in her career?
She grew up with her grandmother. Her mother had to work in Charlotte. And so she would travel to Charlotte and travel to DC to stay with her father. And she really was kind of this very well-loved child. Even though she didn't grow up in riches, she grew up in poverty. She was really kind of a star in her little community. They called her the child with a big mind. She had such a big mind. So she proceeds to go, had to work her way through college. She went to work at a bus station making drinks and the white section, and they had a kind of rush during Christmas, and she was helping to hand the drinks to the white lady on the counter. And this is during segregation, and her boss said, "Get up, stand up, stop hiding behind the counter, just go in and work." So she kept to integrate things by default, which is an interesting aspect we don't think about. So she decided to become a teacher, and she attends Johnson C. Smith University. And then she starts off teaching in a segregated school and really learns from the African-American women principal there, Jane Hemphill. One of the things she taught her is that you don't just teach, you become a part of the child's lives. So when they first met their students, they had to go to their homes and see what their homes look like to better gauge how to teach those children, what were these children going through. And so she really realized that after teaching for a while, that there was no kindergartens for poor children in Charlotte at the time, or for children who didn't have money. There was a private kindergarten. So she was able to coach teachers to work for free during the summer to start Charlotte's Teachers Corps in 1964, a kind of public kindergarten for children in the First Ward neighborhood where her school was. And so that's one of the first key things I saw of her leadership abilities, because who wants to work for free? She was able to do that. She got sponsors. And the next year, Head Start comes, and it really kind of looked at her program. Head Start was the War on Poverty program that we still have today for early childhood education. So she proceeds to become one of the first Black person to get a master's degree in educational administration at UNC Greensboro. She was just walking across this campus, and this man would always say hello. And she'd say, "Well, hello, whatever, hello." And they just chit chat, and they're like, "Do you know you're talking to the dean?" She said, "Oh, I didn't know." But she just has this ability to be able to cross class boundaries, race boundaries. And she just talked to him like a regular person, and they became friends. So that would play later on, after she finished, that he really wanted her to become a principal. She's like, "Oh no, I don't want to do that." And, they pushed her to this. She became a principal at Morgan Elementary School, right in the middle of desegregation, and they closed her school. That's one of the downsides of desegregation. They closed primarily African-American schools when they were drawing desegregation plans. And they said, "Well, we want you to be principal of this new school we're building." She said, "Well, I don't know," but it was a new school, predominantly white. She was the principal. It had about 500 students and 3 Black students, 500 whites and 3 Black students. So that's how she ended up in Albemarle. She had been teaching a while. She got academic degrees. So that's one thing. She was ready to do these positions because she had trained and she had prepared for them.
You mentioned that in your research, you're particularly interested in telling the story of teachers during the era of segregated schools and what that process of desegregation looked like. For those who don't know, what was it like teaching at that time? What kind of environment was Bertha Maxwell-Roddey working in?
Right. During segregation, we know in the South, and actually all across the country in several different areas, not just the South, the schools at first were underfunded. You had 2 separate systems. You had a system for white children and for Black children. And for children of different ethnicities, they had to kind of get in where they fit in some way. So some places they had their own separate schools, like in Texas. So in those schools, you had to deal with schools' buildings. Their structures were poorly done, and in some areas there weren't schools at all. So what teachers had to do and what they were prepared to do in their schools was to teach anyway. They were going to fill in the gaps of the inequities in the schools. That was a lot of pressure. Examples, when they got secondhand textbooks, they filled in the information. So they had to know all the information in the textbooks. And so they're trained to go into that. And later years, you have all these programs and concepts and terms like at-risk children. Most of the children in segregated schools were poor, not all, but many of them lacked resources. So you don't write them off, you teach them anyway. So they learned to do that. That wasn't a hindrance to them learning, that just was their situation. They also had to go well beyond what you taught in the classroom. Dr. Roddey, one of her students, and when she was teaching in elementary school, said, I just want to come stay with you and come home with you. She just got a fall in her home. And she said, I'm just going to live with you. And so she informally adopted her. The child grew up in a home with 5 or 6 children in a one-room house. And she really wanted to stay with Dr. Roddey, and Dr. Roddey let her. That's an extreme. That all teachers weren't able to do that. She did, but what they did do was offer their own money, their own funds, take them to events. You really had to go beyond the classroom to try to support these children.
So in her work as an administrator, what were Bertha's goals as a principal, and what were some of the obstacles and conditions that she had to navigate?
Okay, when she taught at the segregated school, her main goal when she learned that they were going to close her school was to protect her students and her teachers. So she went to 2 of the schools where her students were going to go to. And one school was like, well, we'll welcome them. And the other school was like, well, I don't know. Because she had gotten to be friends with the dean, he happened to be friends with the superintendent of schools. So she went to the superintendent of schools and said, you better talk to him because my kids aren't going over there and they're not going to be mistreated. And so he did. She was able to network and form allies with really interesting, diverse groups of people to help facilitate what she wanted. The other thing that she brought was building community relationships. She formed a relationship with a lady who lived in the neighborhood of her segregated school because they needed a bus to take kids places. The school system wouldn't give them a bus. And so this lady raised money to find a bus for them. So that's what she did in the segregated schools. When she transitioned to Albemarle, her goal was to protect the Black students she had, but also to bring in these concepts. She brought parents into the school. They had expertise in things like cooking or mechanics to show the children these things. So she brought in a lot of new concepts, but she did have to deal with a lot of racism and sexism. Some of the people were like, well, a lady principal, I don't know. And some were like, oh, she's a Black principal. And so she's a Black lady principal. So she had an incident where a child was misbehaving and was disciplined, and the parent came to school and found out that the teacher was African-American. And then he said, I'm going to get rid of this teacher. I'm going to the principal. And then they found out that the principal was African-American, Dr. Roddey. And she's like, I'm not taking their child out of the classroom. She likes that class. She just needs to act better. And he said, well, I'm going to the school board. So Dr. Roddey invites the entire school board to meet at her school. It's like, well, they're having a meeting, and you go right ahead and tell them what you want to remove that teacher. And he's like, oh, well, never mind. And so she was able to use her allies and things to kind of mask things. But the children loved her. She got along well with the children. She just had some issues with parents who weren't able or ready to accept having a Black woman principal of their child's school. So that was very stressful for her. She also was being used kind of as a prototype or example for busing when busing was just about to be implemented. And she felt that she had even more pressure. And so she decided she wanted to change things. She had met the dean of the college it was called Human Development at the time at UNC Charlotte. And UNC Charlotte was a new school. It started really in 1965. He had offered her a job. She said, oh, no. And then she saw him again. She said, is that job still open? He said, yes. And so she thought she was going to go and just have a breezy time teaching teachers at UNC Charlotte. Told her it was the height of the Black Studies movement and all these things. So that's the next step she takes. So, yes.
We're speaking with Sonya Ramsey, author of the biography Bertha Maxwell-Roddey, a modern-day race woman and the power of Black leadership. I guess just define race woman for me, and what was your intention behind the title?
Sure. Race woman was a term that emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century by Black newspapers and some Black leaders to identify a person who dedicate their career, their service work, their charitable work to helping African Americans succeed. So if they were able to access education, they dedicated themselves to working with the NAACP, or they opened service homes for young Black women or things. They worked in the club movement. These were the people who really are dedicated to not for money, but for service, for helping people succeed. And it became a term that's really popular. I'm a race woman, I'm a race man. W.B. Du Bois would be a type of that, Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching act and things. But the term faded out a little bit when you actually had the rise of the modern day civil rights movement, where you see the true activists going out. And so I wanted to revive that term. And I also borrowed from the scholar Brittany Cooper to talk about women or talk about people who do race work. There might not be marching in the streets or on TV talking about things, but they're opening doors So after desegregation got a door open for Blacks and for women, these kind of people kept the door open, right? They didn't let it close behind them. And they also built institutions to keep things going, to help things progress. So with her, activism was into not activism against something, but activism for something, for helping students succeed, for building institutions for children, different things like that. So I wanted to revive this term for people that they don't usually get categorized as an activist, but their efforts help to better society in a lot of ways. So
that actually runs into one of my next questions. So, in the term of her activism, what were some of the things that she was fighting for? And it sounds like a lot of the power in her leadership stemmed from her ability to connect with people and bring people together. Would you say that was generally her approach to change and getting things done?
Yes, I call it a pragmatic affability or friendliness or charismatic advocacy. She is a light. You just want to be around her. She's very likable. She's a very funny person. She's not doing as well now, so she doesn't do as many interviews, but 2 years ago, she could have done this interview herself. She'd never retired. Her authenticity helped to propel people to want to join her cause. Some of the things, exceptional things she did was she saw that African-American children in Charlotte had really become susceptible to all the school closings. They really closed most of the dominantly African-American schools, except for a few. And the idea was to build new schools. So she saw, because the students at her school, what they had to go through, some of the things with integration, she thought with smaller children, it was really hard. Then she saw that because of urban renewal in a lot of urban cities, they wanted to rebuild the urban cities. They kind of bulldozed through all the some of the African-American neighborhoods, erased them. And so the neighborhoods were disappearing, the schools were disappearing. And she thought that the children would lose their sense of a landmark or culture. So she, one of her colleagues, Dr. Mary Harper, was an English professor who was going through the tenure process. She said, I have this project for Afro-American Cultural Center. She said, I'll help. And Dr. Relly really kind of embraced it and helped get it off the ground and got a board set up and got all these structures. And that eventually became the Afro-American Cultural and Service Center. And eventually, over the decades, is now the Harvey B. Gantt Center. And that's our premier regional arts museum in the South. It's an $18 million building. It's fancy, it's beautiful. So she was able to build actual physical structures. And she also she became friends with a local artist named Loomis McGlohan. And he was working with the Big Brothers program. She said, they need something for women. And she still started the Big Sisters program. So she was able to build organizations and institutions. When she became a professor at UNC Charlotte with Black Studies, no one really knew what Black Studies was. These student activists had fought for it. And they looked at her with skepticism at first because she's a prim and proper teacher. And they say, are you down with the child? And she's like, whatever, I know how to run this program. She could talk to them. And she became an advocate for Black Studies. Now, since she had been trained as a principal, some of the other Black Studies advocates were just student activists. So they turned they're directors. And so she helped start this organization, the National Council for Black Studies, to help these directors keep their programs because they were losing their programs. Because in an academic environment, if you don't follow the rules or the structure or you don't get funding, your program could disappear. So she wanted them the nuts and bolts of running a program. She taught them. And then they taught her some of the tenets of Black Studies. So she learned from everybody. Her students were brilliant. And things like when she started the Afro-American Cultural Center, they did this art festival with these nationally known artists, and she put one of her students to manage it. She said, you can do it. She's like, okay. So this young woman, still in college, was managing these artists, these persnickety artists. And she learned from that, and now she's a curator at the Smithsonian. So she was able to see leadership abilities in people and not judge them by how old they were or who they were, if their color didn't matter. One of her partners in crime, not real crime, was Ann Carver. Ann Carver was a white woman who grew up in Appalachia. She's still around. And she taught at Morehouse, and she came to UNC Charlotte. And since she taught at Morehouse, some of the people didn't know she was white. And when they saw her, they're like, oh, but she brought her into Black Studies. And so Ann would go around to white faculty and administrators and explain Black Studies was and be really forceful to the extent they were like, Bertha, don't have Ann come around again. She's just a bit too much. We'll do what she said. Just leave it, have her come back. A fierce, staunch ally for African-American studies. And eventually she starts the Women and Gender Studies program at the university, and which I'm the director. So it's kind of interesting. So none of these things these people do are in their job description, but she was able to make them do that because they saw she was working for a cause and they wanted to join in. So that's one of her greatest strengths. She has a great sense of humor of making people feel at ease around her. But she also has the great skill of knowing when to negotiate and knowing when to confront something. So they had an incident at the school in one time when the student magazine had the word N-word and really kind of a derogatory article about women. And the students wanted to do a silent protest. And she said, well, go on and do it. So she encouraged protests, she encouraged things, but whatever the best process, she had the ability to know which one was the best process to use at the time.
So how have things changed when we look at the state of our educational system today? Or how have they not changed? Are there things Bertha is still fighting for?
Well, things have changed a great deal. We have these structures put in place that people like Dr. Roddey implemented, but we need more people like Dr. Roddey who's able to talk to school superintendents, who's able to talk to kids that's in the classroom, who's able to talk to people, his parents, and connect all these people together on shared causes. People kind of become siloed onto their causes and they become real obstinate to the other side. She worked with Republicans. She worked with CEOs. She was friends with the CEO, former CEO of Bank of America, Hugh McCall, who's a force of nature in its own right. And she was able to do this idea of working through these networks by seeing people through their shared humanity, not just they're in this position. She was also authentic when she told people what she thought. She didn't speak in gobbledygook, that blah, blah, blah. You don't know what the person actually said. She spoke honestly to them. It's like, you need to do this. One example, when Hugh McCall was not CEO of Bank of America at the time, he was an upper level official at another bank that eventually became Bank of America. And she's like, Hugh, McCall, you need to divest from South Africa. This is in the 1980s. He's like, what? And she said at a reception, she said, you need to go on and your bank needs to get out of South Africa. And so the people can be free. You just need to do that. And he said, she said, well, he didn't speak to me for a while, but he came back. So she was able to tell the truth to people. So they knew where she stood. And she wasn't perfect. Sometimes she would snap at you, or if you didn't do what you wanted. She's not perfect, but she was able to share her passion. I guess her passion for service, she was able to convey that.
So what do you hope readers most take away from this book?
Yes, I want to have people learn about the people who worked behind the scenes and as institution builders to help process things and make things better for children and students. For example, some of the programs at UNC Charlotte, she started an orientation program for African-American students. They didn't have one to show them that they belonged at the school, that the school could be theirs. They just weren't a person to fill a slot. She taught them how to act and what to do in their classes, sit in the front row, speak up, be prepared, be a presence in the classroom. She also wanted to talk about to people that were able to negotiate things and work with people who are different than them, to seek allies who aren't always the same as they are, to learn how to facilitate things, to look at people's shared humanity. The other thing I wanted people to look at is outside of the educational arena, or even a different aspect of what learning could be. When she became president of Delta Sigma Theta, she wanted to help instill even more leadership opportunities for Black women. And then she formed a partnership with Habitat for Humanity to help build homes. And to get these ladies to go out and build homes was a feat, but she did so because she wanted at the time in the 80s and the 90s that more women could have opportunities for home ownership. So to look at people who are making building structures and institutions a little bit more closely, we definitely want to look at our activists in front, our pundits and things, but looking at the people behind the scenes that make work. The original title for my book was After the Marches, and it didn't work as the book title, but as a theme, what happened after the marches, after the civil rights, people died down a little bit and things. And also to look at the work of Black women who also fought against sexism and racism to facilitate things and make things better for people.
Well, Sonya, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me. That was all the questions that I had for you, but is there anything missing that you'd like me or our listeners to know? A favorite story of Bertha, maybe?
I do. So when she was chairperson of the Black Studies program, or the African American and African Studies program, she wanted to go beyond the school grounds and help the community. And so she formed a partnership with a work release program from jail, for to have people coming out of jail. They worked for a while, and she brought them to campus, and she worked with Ann Carver, and they brought the students to campus. And one student was, he was a little misguided. He had taken some textbooks and was trying to resell them back to the students, and she caught them and she chastised him. And for that, and he picked her up and her legs were swinging. She said, "Put me down." And everybody was scared. She said, "Put me down." And he put her down. But they had forgotten, they had neglected to tell the administration. So one of her phrases was, go on and do things and ask for forgiveness later. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness later. And the administrator's like, we can be liable. The entire school could have been, college could have been liable if something happened. She's like, oh, really? So she just went out, and she and Ann Carver to do these things. When that student eventually turned his life around and became a deacon in her church, it's just that she really saw people that you would have overlooked or you didn't think she should work with. Another quick story is she was trying to get a Black administrator, upper level administrator at the university at the time, and this was the early 70s. And there was a student, an older student, a former Vietnam vet, who was there, and he really just looked distinguished. And she would bring him to meetings every week. They would go to the chancellor's office and say, "By chance, have you moved on this idea of a Black administrator? We just wanted to see what was going on." And they thought he was her attorney, and it was a student. And they finally eventually got Dr. Robert Albright, and he eventually becomes president of Johnson C. Smith University. So she was opening doors, building structures, but she brought students along with her. So they had unprecedented access to things that they would not have normally had opportunities to have. There are a lot more funny stories I can tell, but also a little bit about the National Council for Black Studies. It is still going on today, and it's a premier organization for its field, and just having to interact with those very, very masculine Black studies advocates was an interesting story in itself too. So learning different things. So she's definitely an advocate, feminist advocate for women, advocate for African-American students and all students in general.
Sonya Ramsey is an associate professor and the director of the Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, and the author of Bertha Maxwell-Roddey, a modern-day race woman and the power of Black leadership. It's out now through the University Press of Florida. Sonya, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. It's produced by me, Jesse King. Our executive producer is Dr. Ellen Chartock, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Thanks again to Dr. Sonya Ramsey for speaking with us this week. To learn more about our guests and the show, check us out at WAMCpodcasts.org. You can find episodes new and old there as well, or anywhere you get your podcasts. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at 51% Radio. Let us know what you think and if you have a story you'd like to share as well. Until next week, thanks again for tuning in. I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool, no electricity, hot rain on the concrete, sweet melting little